Hi, this is Dr. Robert Guthrie again, and we're back again to continue our study of the New Testament. This is in lieu of the Sunday school class at Jerome United Methodist Church here in Dublin, Ohio. And we've been working our way through the New Testament. We're now into what are called the letters to all Christians. These are a series of letters, usually not terribly long, that don't have a specific congregation like Romans or Galatians, like Paul's letters did, that are kind of apparently written for general distribution in the Christian community. So they're called the letters to all Christians. This one is James, and it's a challenging letter to approach scholastically because there's no clear group to whom it's directed. There's no clear identification of the author. It is identification, which doesn't make a lot of sense. And it's an odd type of format. So we'll discuss it. It historically was one of the last books included in the New Testament. When you look at the history of the New Testament, it was formed up between the Council of Nicaea in 325 and about 362 when the last description was. So in the middle of the 4th century. And at the beginning of the 4th century, James was not included among the definitive books, which were the 4 Gospels and the Paul letters and several of the other things. And it was always on the possibly or probably authentic. Authentic meaning that the criteria were used for the development of the New Testament, where it had to claim apostolic authorship, which this one did. It had to have been known for a long time. So it had to have been known in the Christian writers of the time. We have records of Christian scholars and leaders starting in the early 2nd century, 100, 120, starting to write various things. It had to be known to that group, and it had to be matching up to the emerging Christian theology, which became very prominent in the 325 of the Council of Nicaea. So James is a little bit odd in that it wasn't as widely known up until about 300 or a little bit later as some of the other epistles were. So it kind of gets into the authentic or the canonization group late, almost around the time that the final lists were put together. So it has a very interesting history. It's impossible to really date it. If you look at the timing of it, nobody really knows, since it wasn't from a specific site, it wasn't to a specific group, so you really can't date it. As I look through this, I would put it in the early 2nd century, 100 to 110, 120, amongst the latter books that got into the New Testament. But that's a guess. Let's be very clear here. Now, it claims to be written by James, the brother of the Lord. And if you remember your history from Acts and the Paul letters, the leader, the patriarch, essentially, of the Jerusalem church was James, the brother of Jesus, which is a very interesting development historically, because early in Jesus' ministry, his family had doubts about him. Had he lost his mind or something? And then they came to be believers also in that later era. But this James was murdered in 62 AD. And he was a Galilean, like Jesus was. The other James, the apostle, James, the brother of John, the son of Zebedee, was executed by King Herod in 44 BC. So it seems to be very unlikely that the book could have been written that early, either by 44 or by 62, because it really wasn't known around the Christian community until 300. And it would have had plenty of time to spread. So I just think that's extremely unlikely. So nobody really does know who wrote it. I don't know who wrote it. It claims to be from the brother of the Lord, but remember in the history of the New Testament era, to claim apostolic authorship was a compliment to the apostle, not what we would regard as copyright infringement or plagiarism. So the situation was very, very different. So it's a very interesting challenge as to how to place this. And so the question about authenticity and authorship, the other wrinkle about authorship that I think is extremely unlikely that it was written by James, the son of Zebedee, or James, the brother of the Lord, it's written in a very elegant Greek, with an excellent vocabulary. Those people were both Galileans. Whether James, the son of Zebedee, could even write as a Galilean fisherman, it's doubtful. James, the brother of the Lord, we just don't know whether he could read and write, and he probably couldn't write Greek in this really elegant style. So it's a difficult one to place. I don't have any problem with it being in the New Testament. Don't misread it. It does touch me in a way that we talked about. Hebrews not touching me last week. But you can't really place it in a variety of these situations. So it's an interesting and challenging book in other ways. It was supposed to be written dedicated to the 12 tribes of the dispersion. I have a little bit of a smile about this. There were the original 12 tribes and the dispersion refers to the scattering of the Jewish community around the Eastern Mediterranean during the Roman Empire. But most of the tribes, of the northern tribes, had disappeared. And there were very few people who identified themselves as with the 10 lost tribes. They were taken into exile when the Assyrians conquered their capital at what became Samaria in the 8th century, and they disappeared into the culture of Nineveh and Assyria. And there's a little bit of a remnant of the Samaritans who are still there. So it's an odd description because there were only two prominent historical tribes, Benjamin and Judah, which were the tribes of the southern kingdom. So it's an odd description to whom it's written. And its historical impact in regards to all things is somewhat problematic. It's a very interesting book in that really the major stress is that faith without deeds is empty. That if you're truly a Christian, you have to act it out and you have to have Christian deeds. The medieval Roman Catholic Church took this to say, okay, basically you can score up points by doing good deeds. These points will help get you into heaven, and since some of these great popes and great church leaders have built up a big excess of all these good deeds, we'll sell them to you, called indulgences, so that you can buy your way into heaven, or you can get your grandpa out of purgatory, or your husband or your wife out of purgatory and move them on. And this was a fantastic corruption of the church. There's no evidence anywhere in the scriptures that, even in this letter, that you could actually buy good deeds from anybody. And the author of this letter, who hated the rich people, would go ape if they saw how they were misusing his letter. So they took it and corrupted it to apply to sell you an indulgence. Luther hated that so much, Martin Luther, that he tried to pitch the book out of the New Testament. When he did his translation, he put it at the back because he thought it had been totally corrupted. And if you read it, and it's a good read, it's only 5 chapters, it won't take long, you'll see that it's actually an interesting book. And it's got some challenges beyond that. And one of the challenges I find the most interesting is he starts right, the design of it is a little bit different. Paul's letters are very clearly communications to a set group of people. He has an introduction, he has the theme or themes of it, and then he has a closing where he's going to carry it and greetings from various people that are with him and all that. When we got to Hebrews last week, we talked about it was really much more written like a sermon. It started slowly, it built up to its crescendo in 10th and 11th and 12th chapters, and then it closed like a sermon is. This is somewhere in between. It's clearly not a letter to any addressed people. It just says to the 12 tribes of the dispersion, which would mean written to the Jewish Christian converts, the Jewish people who convert to Christianity. But it doesn't start with any personal greetings or anything like it. It just pitches right into it. So rather than and it doesn't really have the climax and the close like a sermon does. It gets right to the meat of it right at the beginning. So to me, it seems more like a diatribe. He's kind of angry and he's having a temper tantrum, which is what I use to describe Paul in Galatians. And he's jumped on this thing and he's going to say his bit and pass it around to people and shape up, a polemic, diatribe, whatever you want to say, because it doesn't really even, have the flow of a sermon like Hebrews does. So it's a very interesting thing. The other thing I said most interesting is, you have to do these deeds. He doesn't say what the deeds are. It's very interesting. What are the deeds? My assumption for the deeds is that they're to care for the poor and the disadvantaged in society. And that's an important thing, because remember that there was no social safety network in the Roman Empire or in first century Palestine, Jewish Palestine. It just didn't exist. If you were poor, that was your problem. And if you were a widow, and you couldn't get remarried, you didn't have family support you, well, you were on your own. So it was a total lack. So it's a very good point. He doesn't spell it out what it is. He just talks about deeds. And then very early on, and we did talk about the importance of caring for widows in Hebrews, but he begins in chapter 1 with a direct criticism right at the beginning about the rich. And this attack on the wealthy goes right through the 5 chapters. And remember, they did not have a society like we have now, where we have multiple layers of wealth in this, from the poorest who were on social welfare situations. We have the poor working people. You have the basic middle class. You have upper middle class, which is the big chunk of American society. And you have some very, very wealthy people. So it's not an issue that we're unfamiliar with. And we have seen a lot of concern recently in the last 40 years about the wealthy getting wealthier in a greater spread here. So he would actually have a lot to say to us in our own time here. And so he begins to pitch right into this in the first chapter. And he's got some very interesting other things he talks about. To persevere through times of adversity. I agree, we really do, but it's not clear what adversity he's talking about. We talked last couple weeks about the persecutions didn't start until about 95 in Western Turkey. It could be referring to that. It could be something else. He makes the point that God does not tempt man. He said man is tempted by human nature. I actually agree with that. I think it's, we all carry evil inside of us, whether you want to consider it original sin from Adam or the evils of human nature. We all have that. And he talks about that it's not God stressing you, it's your own evil nature stressing you. Chapter 2, he comes right out and says something of great value to us. He says, do not kowtow to the rich people who come to your meetings. He pointed out what people traditionally do. If a well-dressed, wealthy person comes into the meeting, you go over and you greet them, and you find them a nice special seat, and you do all these other things. And the poor person, disheveled, comes in, and you put them in the corner. And we all would say, oh, we wouldn't do that, but we all would do it. So, let's not be naive here about our own human weaknesses, because I certainly have a lot of them. I can't speak for everybody else out there. I can just speak for myself. But it's a very good point. Don't kowtow to the rich. Respect them like you do, but respect the poor. And then he follows with a severe admonition to follow up with your deeds. Again, it doesn't explain what the deeds are, and he has a very strong attack in the end of the first chapter on the weaknesses in controlling, quote, the tongue, unquote. It strikes me, because I'm a professional talker, as you all who know me know, so I have to be very careful with what I say, and my mouth can be useful in situations like this, and it can be very negative if I don't control myself. So that one spoke right to me. So it's an interesting book. It does speak to us directly. And then again in chapter 2, he's back into commenting on the importance of doing deeds without being specific about what they are. And if you remember the history of the Methodist Church, the good deeds we did are what really made us extraordinarily successful in the United States, here in America, from about 1800 on up to the late 1700s, actually, all through the 1800s, up into the mid of the 20th century. It was called the social gospel. The church felt that we were compelled by our faith to act it out. So we led the abolition movement against slavery. We led a lot of the education movements to get schools started and teach children how to read and write. We stressed the rights of the Native American population, and we ran a lot of social welfare things. We had orphanages and other things, and the poorhouse and things like that. And and since the World War II era, where the government started to get involved in this in the Great Depression under Roosevelt, a lot of Methodist churches have backed off with this, and I think it's been very harmful to us to have forgotten the social gospel that our belief does force us to do these things to take care of the disadvantaged, and it's really hurt us on growth and spreading our message. So I do think that the social gospel being lost is an important thing that we need to think about then, because that's what really made the Methodist Church very, very successful. And it's also, he stresses that it's part of loving your neighbor as yourself, a very, very important point. And years ago, I heard a sermon by a guy named Tom Skinner who made the point, Jesus didn't say love your neighbor instead of yourself. And if you don't love yourself first, your neighbor better look out, which is really good advice. We have to learn to love ourselves too, and because we won't be able to love our neighbors unless we love ourselves. So living the right Christian way, having the right Christian values is a way of loving ourselves. When you get into chapter 3 is an interesting comment. Only a few of us can be teachers. It's an interesting thing to me. I've been a teacher of Methodist Sunday schools for a long time. Hopefully I would be included in that group. But it's an interesting thing there. When you look at, then he's back to stressing the importance of mercy over money, and stressing the importance of controlling inside the church our own jealousy and our own ambition, both in our private, personal lives and in our church lives. These things are human weaknesses that just create a lot of trouble. He criticizes pride and selfishness quite strongly, and if you think about it, these are really severe weaknesses that can affect everybody, particularly church people. I find that we can get way too full of ourselves in church, and whether it's pastors or lay people, we have to control these human weaknesses ourselves. We have to realize that we have these weaknesses, and his point is they lead to Christian disunity. We start to fight in the congregations. Most of the fights are not worth having, in my observation. That we just need to step back from the fighting and love each other as we're supposed to, and put away the pride and selfishness, and try to struggle forward together. He again wraps up with, in the last chapter, with criticism of the rich, making a point which Jesus had made in some of his parables, that our time is short. That you accumulate all this wealth, and then what does it do you? You're going to die, you can't take it with you. It's almost right out of Ecclesiastes. Some scholars think that the author of this was really drawing heavily on what's called the wisdom literature, Ecclesiastes being the most common. Proverbs and Psalms were part of that, the wisdom literature. Song of Solomon was there too. That seems almost right out of Ecclesiastes, which talk about, what does pride do with us? It doesn't really do us any good. So you show someone who's got a similarity with the Hebrew Scriptures. So he stresses that all these things are short term. They're not binding. They don't go with us into to the next world. And chapter 5, he stresses that we need to be patient in waiting for the Lord's return. Remember, the first century Christians, second century, thought Jesus was coming back fairly promptly. Clearly, it hasn't come back. It's been almost 2,000 years, and we haven't. But many of the Christians were expecting at the time. But our own time here on the earth is relatively short. And then we need to continue to pray for each other in adversity, and strive to bring wayward members back into the fold, which is different than end of Hebrews. They said, if you turn away, you don't come back. I don't buy that. I think people have drifted away from the church, and we need to try to invite them back in, see if there's something that we can do to encourage them to return. And then it doesn't wrap up. It just kind of stops. So it's an interesting book. I like it. I get a lot from it. I think it speaks to us a lot. The worship of money in our society is, in my opinion, terrible. It's obsessive, and we need to struggle with it. And the worship of money in certain congregations, there's the group that call themselves the prosperity gospel. I always think, what a lot of hogwash. There's no surging of prosperity in Jesus' words at all. I just think that's utter hypocrisy. And so I think there's a lot here to speak to us, but it's very challenging for us to follow this. But it's an interesting book. Like I said, it kind of starts abruptly, stops abruptly, and I'll stop abruptly then to match up with it. And we'll be back in a week and go into the Peter letters. This is Dr. Guthrie. Thank you very much. Always a pleasure.